All right, so are you ready to dive into a story that feels like it's straight out of the headlines?
Oh, absolutely. Sounds intriguing already.
Yeah, it's a wild one, that's for sure. The Curious Case of Abdul Karim Telgi.
Telgia. Okay, I'm intrigued.
This guy was the mastermind behind India's massive stamp paper scam.
Wow,
Yeah.
okay. I've heard bits and pieces about this, but never the full story.
It's a doozy, and it really makes you question, like, how do these large-scale financial crimes even happen?
Right. It's easy to think of it as just numbers on a screen, but there's a whole human element to it.
Exactly. Ambition, desperation, a little bit of audacity, especially in early 2000s India. Imagine this booming economy, opportunity everywhere.
Yeah, kind of like the anyone can make it mentality,
Totally. But also this undercurrent of, maybe you can bend the rules a bit if you're clever enough.
which is where our guy Telgi comes in, right?
He does. And
Yeah.
our main source for this deep dive, it's this YouTube video transcript called The Telgi Story Scam 2003. It's basically a Bollywoodized version of the whole thing.
Oh, I love that. So, what's Telgi's deal? Was he always a criminal mastermind?
Not exactly. The transcript paints this picture of a guy from really humble beginnings.
Hmm.
Worked his way up, got a degree, moved to Mumbai, the city of dreams, hoping to make it big. Pretty relatable, right?
Totally. The classic story.
Yeah. He even bought a house, a car, started his own travel agency, living the dream until, well, he wasn't.
Uh-oh, what happened?
He got caught up in this whole visa scam, landed himself in jail.
Oof, not bad.
And ironically, prison became his, twisted business school.
Hold on, you're gonna have to break that one down for me.
Think about it. Jail throws him into this world where he's surrounded by seasoned criminals, right?
Ah, okay, I see where you're going with this.
And that's where he meets a guy known as Kishan Bengali. This guy introduces him to the world of counterfeit stamp papers.
Counterfeit stamp papers, I have to admit, I don't know much about those.
Right, because it's not something you encounter every day. Imagine any legal document, a contract, a property deed, even just a simple affidavit. In India, a lot of these documents need a stamp paper, which is basically official paper with the government seal on it.
So it's like proof that you paid the required tax, like a notary, but more formal.
Exactly. It's proof of legitimacy. But the system, like many systems that rely on physical security, was ripe for, well, exploitation.
Ah, I see. So that's where Telgi's little prison MBA comes into play.
Exactly. And the transcript describes how these fake stamp papers were practically indistinguishable from the real deal.
Wow. That's pretty scary when you think about it. So how did he manage to pull this off on a large scale?
This is where Telge's ambition goes into overdrive. We're not talking about just a few fakes here. He built a whole network of agents across India, bribing officials left and right.
No way. How high up did this go?
Hi. The transcript even mentions government printing press employees, police officers, even politicians being in on it.
Wow. Okay, so this wasn't just some small-time operation.
Not at all. It was a whole system failure.
Mm.
And it shows how individual greed can get all tangled up with systemic corruption, and boom, you have this recipe for large-scale fraud.
It's mind-boggling how these things can spiral out of control.
And the craziest part? The transcript says Telgi's daily earnings went from, tens of thousands to lakhs, then crores of rupees.
Hold on. How much are we talking about here?
Hundreds of thousands, then tens of millions of rupees every day. He was living large, lavish parties, even financing a Bollywood movie.
Wow. Sounds like he was on top of the world.
For a while, yeah. But you know what they say? What goes up?
Must come down.
Exactly. And Telgi's story is no different. That same ambition that drove him to success, it also fueled a ruthlessness.
Ruthlessness. How so?
Well, the transcript mentions the murder of one of the key players in Telgi's network.
Oh, wow. Things are getting serious. Why was he murdered?
Likely because he was demanding more money from Telgi.
So it sounds like greed was both the driving force and the eventual downfall of this whole operation.
It's a good reminder that these huge financial crimes, they don't just exist in a vacuum. You know what I mean? Like, there are real people getting hurt.
Oh, absolutely.
And the people closest to these masterminds, sometimes they suffer the most.
Yeah, for sure.
The transcript even mentions, how much this whole thing weighed on Telgi's family.
Really?
His wife talks about how lonely she felt, how worried she was, even with all the money he was bringing in.
That's heartbreaking, honestly. It's like this hidden cost of crime that we don't always think about. And speaking of things we don't always see coming, remember those investigations we talked about earlier?
Oh, yeah, the ones in multiple states, right?
Yeah, those. They start ramping up the pressure on Teldi's network, and I mean, from all sides. It's like the walls are closing in.
Right. And you know, his network, it's built on lies, deceit, and everyone's just out for themselves.
Exactly. And that catches up with you eventually.
It always does.
Yeah.
So what happens? Does it all just fall apart?
Oh, it gets messy. Really messy. The transcript talks about this crazy raid the police orchestrated.
A raid. Like straight out of a movie.
Pretty much. And it brings Telgi's whole empire crashing down around him.
Wow. Almost poetic justice when you think about it.
Right. All that ambition, the same network that made him, it's what takes him down in the end.
Mm-hmm.
The people he brought in, the ones who helped him build this empire, they're the ones who end up being his downfall.
Okay, but let's be real. This scam, it was massive.
Yeah.
Like deeply rooted in corruption. Can one raid really be the end of it all?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Because you can arrest the guy in charge, but what about the system that allowed it to happen in the first place?
Right, exactly. And the transcript doesn't really go into a ton of detail about the legal proceedings, but it does mention some arrests.
Oh yeah, like who?
Printing press employees, police officers, even a few politicians got caught up in the sweep.
Which just proves it wasn't a one-man show at all.
Nope. This was a full-blown system failure. And it highlights something really important. Holding individuals accountable. That's crucial, of course. But it's only one piece of the puzzle. If you want to actually stop something like this from happening again, you've got to address the root cause.
The corruption.
Exactly. You've got to fix the system itself, the weaknesses that let someone like Telgi manipulate it in the first place.
It's like you can try to plug one hole in a sinking ship, but if you don't fix the whole thing, you're just delaying the inevitable.
A perfect analogy. And that's why cases like Telgi's are so fascinating. They force us to confront these uncomfortable truths about the systems we all rely on every day.
And the fact that human greed is, well, a powerful motivator.
Exactly. So we need to be vigilant. We have to constantly push for reform and transparency.
Because if we don't, there's always going to be another Telgi waiting in the wings, ready to exploit those weaknesses.
100%. So as we move into the final part of Telgi's story, I think it's important to keep those takeaways in mind.
Totally. So what are the big takeaways? What impact did all of this have?
Well, the sheer scale of this scam is just mind-blowing. We're talking an estimated 30,000 crore rupees.
Wait, how much is that in? Like real money?
Billions. With a B. Billions of dollars siphoned right out of the Indian economy. The impact on the government, on businesses, on everyday people, it's hard to even quantify.
It's crazy. And we're not even talking about the impact on people's faith in the system.
Exactly. It's like this ripple effect. Telgi's scam, it didn't just steal money. It eroded public trust in institutions, the legal system, even just the idea of a legitimate document.
Right. If you can't even trust a piece of paper with a government seal on it, what can you trust?
It's a scary thought, and that erosion of trust, that feeling of vulnerability, it can be just as damaging as the financial losses themselves.
So where do we go from here? What lessons can we take away from this whole crazy story of Abdul Rahim Telgi? More importantly, what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen again?
Those are questions that deserve a deep dive all on their own.
So we've gone down this rabbit hole with Telgi, right? We've seen how he built this massive scheme, how it all came crashing down. But I gotta say, it still feels like there's more to uncover here.
Oh, absolutely. Telgi's story might feel like an extreme case, but those vulnerabilities he exploited, they're everywhere.
So what does that mean for the average person? Someone listening to this thinking, okay, that's nuts, but I'm not running a counterfeit ring out of my basement.
Right, but here's the thing. Think about the systems you interact with every single day. Banks, government offices, even level of trust.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Telgi's story, it's a reminder to be cautious. Don't just accept things at face value. Ask questions, especially when something seems too good to be true.
Be a healthy skeptic, right?
Exactly. And on a bigger scale, this whole case highlights how important things like regulations and transparency are.
Because without those, there's always going to be someone like Telgi waiting to take advantage.
And the consequences, as we've seen, can be absolutely devastating. So yeah, it's a wild story, but it's also a cautionary tale.
It really is. Any last thoughts for our listeners before we wrap up? Something to ponder on their way to work or, while they're trying to avoid their inbox?
Here's something I always think about. Telgi's scam, it captured everyone's attention. It was in the headlines. It was turned into a movie. People were outraged. But what about the scams that don't make the news? The ones happening every day, quietly, right under our noses. What systems are we part of without even realizing it that might be vulnerable? It's a question worth asking ourselves.
Wow. Okay, yeah, that's definitely something to think about. So from the streets of Mumbai to, well, potentially our own backyards, the case of Abdul Rahim Telgi reminds us that sometimes truth is stranger than fiction, right? And that we always need to stay vigilant, ask those tough questions, and never stop fighting for a more just and equitable world. That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.